The dust hadn't settled on Main Street when Jake Morrison dismounted his weathered stallion, boots hitting the hard-packed earth with deliberate silence. His grey eyes swept across the gathered crowd, noting the way their faces twisted with ugly purpose, torches flickering in the pre-dawn darkness. The widow's house stood at the end of the street like a condemned fortress, its windows glowing amber against the threatening sky. Jake had ridden hard through the night, following whispers of trouble that had reached him at the saloon 3 towns over. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, like a rattlesnake coiled in tall grass. Margaret Hayes pressed her face against the cold window pane, watching the mob grow larger by the minute, their voices rising like a violent storm. Her hands trembled as she clutched the lace curtain, the same hands that had supposedly pulled the trigger on her husband Thomas just 2 days prior. The sheriff had found no evidence, but in Redemption Creek, evidence mattered less than gossip and old grudges. Thomas had made enemies with his gambling debts and sharp tongue, and now those enemies wanted her to pay the price. She whispered a prayer to whatever God might still be listening to a woman marked for death. Judge Crawford stood on the courthouse steps, his black coat billowing in the desert wind, as he addressed the restless crowd with calculated fervor. His voice carried the authority of law, but the passion of vengeance, promising swift justice before the sun crested the eastern mountains. Behind him, Sheriff Coleman shifted nervously, his badge catching the torchlight as he wondered if he could control what was about to unfold. The judge had been Thomas Hayes' poker partner for years, losing more money than he cared to admit to the dead man's skillful hands. Jake studied the dynamics of the crowd, recognizing the faces of men he'd seen in saloons and trading posts across the territory. There was Bill Hancock, the blacksmith, whose wife had run off with a traveling preacher, now seeking someone else to blame for life's cruelties. Sam Porter stood near the front, still bitter about losing his ranch to Thomas Hayes in a card game 6 months back. These weren't men seeking justice. They were vultures circling a wounded animal, hungry for blood to wash away their own failures. The silent cowboy had earned his reputation not through words, but through actions that spoke louder than thunder. In Dodge City, he'd faced down 3 gunfighters without drawing his weapon, using only his presence and steady gaze. In Tombstone, he'd walked between feuding families and somehow convinced them to lay down their arms. Now, as he approached the crowd, his spurs made the only sound in the sudden hush that fell over Main Street. Margaret saw him through the window, a lone figure moving against the tide of hatred, his long coat trailing behind him like the wings of some dark angel. She didn't know who he was or why he'd come, but something in his deliberate movements gave her the first hope she'd felt since finding Thomas dead in their parlor. The cowboy's hand rested easy on his gun belt, not threatening but ready, like a man who understood the weight of the moment. His face remained impassive, but his eyes held a fire that made even the boldest men in the crowd take a step back. Judge Crawford's voice rose to a crescendo as he pointed toward the widow's house, declaring that justice delayed was justice denied. The crowd murmured agreement, their bloodlust growing stronger with each passing moment as dawn approached like a deadline. Some carried ropes, others brandished pistols, all united in their determination to see Margaret Hayes swing before breakfast. The judge's own guilt over his gambling losses to Thomas drove his passionate speech, though he disguised it as righteous indignation. Jake positioned himself between the mob and the house, his silence more powerful than any speech could have been. He'd seen innocent people die before, watched as fear and hatred turned ordinary citizens into murderous beasts, and he'd sworn never to let it happen again where he could prevent it. The widow's guilt or innocence mattered less than the fact that she deserved a fair trial, not the rough justice of a lynch mob. His presence alone had already planted seeds of doubt in some of the crowd's minds. Sheriff Coleman found himself caught between his duty to uphold the law and his fear of the growing mob's anger. He'd known Margaret Hayes since she was a girl, remembered her kindness to his own family during hard times, and couldn't reconcile that memory with the cold-blooded killer the judge painted her to be. The evidence was circumstantial at best. Thomas found shot in his own home, Margaret the only one present when neighbors arrived. But circumstance wasn't proof, and the sheriff's oath demanded more than suspicion. As the first pale light began to creep over the mountains, Jake finally spoke, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade through silk. His words were few, but carefully chosen, challenging the crowd to consider what kind of men they truly were and what kind of town they wanted Redemption Creek to become. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead as if nature itself was watching to see which way the scales of justice would tip. The crowd stirred uneasily as Jake's words hung in the air, some men shuffling their feet and avoiding his steady gaze. Bill Hancock spat into the dust and muttered something about outsiders meddling in local affairs, but his voice lacked the conviction it had held moments before. The torches seemed to flicker less brightly, as if even the flames were uncertain about the righteousness of their cause. Margaret watched from her window, hardly daring to breathe as she witnessed this strange cowboy single-handedly confronting an entire town. Something in his calm demeanor reminded her of her late father, a man who'd never raised his voice but could command respect with a single look. Jake knew that crowds were like wild horses, dangerous when spooked, but manageable if you understood their nature and moved with deliberate purpose. He'd grown up on a ranch outside San Antonio, learning from his father that sometimes the quietest voice carried the most authority. The men before him weren't evil, just frightened and angry, looking for someone to blame for the violence that had invaded their peaceful town. Thomas Hayes had been a gambling man with a quick temper, the kind who made enemies faster than friends, and his death had opened old wounds. Judge Crawford's face flushed red with anger as he realized his carefully orchestrated lynch mob was beginning to waver. He'd counted on the early morning hour and the crowd's bloodlust to carry out swift vengeance, settling the gambling debts Thomas Hayes had held over him forever. The judge stepped down from the courthouse, his expensive boots clicking against the wooden steps as he approached Jake with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his orders followed. His hand moved toward the derringer hidden in his vest pocket, a small but deadly insurance policy for moments like these. Margaret's mind raced back to the night Thomas had died, searching for details that might save her life in the growing daylight. She remembered the sound of breaking glass, the smell of whiskey and gunpowder, and Thomas's surprised expression as he fell forward across their dining table. But there had been something else, a shadow moving past the window, too quick to identify, but definitely there. The sheriff had dismissed her claims about an intruder, focusing instead on the gun found in her trembling hands and the powder burns on her dress. Sheriff Coleman approached Jake cautiously, recognizing something familiar in the man's bearing that reminded him of his own cavalry days during the Apache campaigns. The cowboy's posture spoke of military training, the kind of discipline that came from facing death and emerging intact on the other side. Coleman had seen enough violence to know that this silent stranger wasn't looking for a fight, but would be formidable if forced into one. The sheriff's hand moved away from his gun, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the crowd. The blacksmith Bill Hancock pushed forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow in the torchlight as he challenged Jake's right to interfere. His voice boomed across the street, demanding to know who this stranger thought he was and why he cared about defending a murderous woman. But even as he spoke, Hancock's eyes kept darting toward Jake's gun hand, noting the worn leather of his holster and the easy way the cowboy wore his weapons. Years of working the forge had made Hancock strong, but he'd never faced a man who radiated such quiet danger. Jake's response came not in words, but in a subtle shift of his stance, a movement so slight that only experienced gunfighters would recognize its significance. He'd learned long ago that sometimes showing strength prevented having to use it, and the message was clear to anyone who knew how to read such signs. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, some of the older men remembering stories they'd heard about silent gunfighters who could end conflicts before they truly began. Sam Porter, still bitter about losing his ranch, found his courage faltering as he studied Jake's impassive face. Margaret felt a flicker of hope as she watched the crowd's unity begin to fracture, individual faces showing doubt where there had been only certainty before. She thought about the life she'd built with Thomas, imperfect as it had been, and the future that now hung by a thread in the growing dawn light. Thomas had been a difficult man, prone to drinking and gambling, but he'd never raised a hand to her in anger. Their marriage had been one of convenience rather than passion, but she'd grown fond of him over the years, making his sudden death all the more shocking. The sun continued its relentless climb toward the horizon, each passing minute bringing the mob's threatened deadline closer to reality. Judge Crawford pulled out his pocket watch, a gold timepiece that had belonged to Thomas Hayes before their final poker game, and announced that dawn was less than an hour away. His voice carried a note of desperation now, as if he understood that his window of opportunity was closing along with the darkness. The judge's gambling debts ran deeper than anyone in town knew, and Margaret's inheritance was the only thing standing between him and financial ruin. Jake finally spoke again, his words cutting through the morning air like a church bell, calling people to conscience rather than vengeance. He asked a simple question that struck at the heart of every man present. What kind of legacy did they want to leave for their children in Redemption Creek? The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of horses shifting nervously and the distant howl of a coyote, as if the wild itself was bearing witness to this moment of moral reckoning in the growing light of dawn. The spell of Jake's words shattered like glass when Judge Crawford pulled his derringer and aimed it directly at the silent cowboy's chest. The crowd gasped and stepped back, suddenly realizing they were witnessing something far more dangerous than a simple lynch mob gathering. Crawford's hand shook with barely contained rage as he declared that no drifter would interfere with Redemption Creek's justice, his mask of legal authority finally slipping to reveal the desperate gambler beneath. The morning light caught the gun's silver barrel, creating a deadly gleam that matched the wild look in the judge's eyes. Margaret pressed herself against the window, watching in horror as the situation spiraled toward inevitable violence. Jake didn't move, didn't even blink as he stared down the barrel of Crawford's weapon with the same calm expression he'd worn throughout the confrontation. His hands remained at his sides, but everyone present could feel the coiled tension in his frame, like a rattlesnake preparing to strike. Years of facing death had taught him that panic was often more deadly than bullets, and that sometimes the best defense was absolute stillness. The crowd held its collective breath, sensing that they were about to witness something that would be talked about in saloons for decades to come. Sheriff Coleman's hand moved instinctively toward his own weapon, torn between his duty and his growing suspicion about the judge's motives. The first shot came not from Crawford's derringer, but from the shadows beside Margaret's house, where a figure had been watching the entire confrontation unfold. The bullet struck the dirt between Jake and the judge, sending up a small puff of dust that seemed to freeze everyone in place like a photograph. The man emerged from the darkness, limping slightly and clutching his side, his face bearing the unmistakable features of Thomas Hayes, very much alive despite being supposedly buried 2 days prior. The crowd's shocked gasps echoed across Main Street as the dead man raised his hands to show he was unarmed, his appearance shattering every assumption they'd held about Margaret's guilt. Thomas Hayes looked like he'd been through hell, his clothes torn and bloodstained, his face bearing fresh bruises that spoke of a recent struggle. His voice was hoarse as he called out to the stunned crowd, explaining how he'd awakened tied up in an abandoned mine shaft miles outside town, left there to die by someone who wanted him gone. He'd managed to escape just hours ago. Riding hard through the night to reach Redemption Creek before dawn brought tragedy to his innocent wife. The poker debts, the gambling losses, the enemies he'd made, none of it justified what had almost happened here this morning. Margaret's scream of joy and relief cut through the air as she recognized her husband's voice calling her name. Judge Crawford's face went white as bleached bone, the derringer trembling in his grip as his carefully constructed plan crumbled around him like a house of cards. He'd paid men to kidnap Thomas and stage the murder scene, planting evidence that would implicate Margaret and leave him free to claim the Hayes property as payment for gambling debts. The judge had never intended for Thomas to escape, had counted on the mine shaft becoming his permanent grave, while Margaret swung from a rope for his murder. Now, with his victim standing alive before the entire town, Crawford faced exposure and ruin on a scale he'd never imagined possible. The crowd's mood shifted like wind-changing direction, anger and bloodlust transforming into confusion and shame as they realized how close they'd come to lynching an innocent woman. Men who had been shouting for Margaret's death moments before now shuffled their feet and avoided eye contact, understanding that they'd been manipulated by their own prejudices and the judge's lies. Bill Hancock dropped his torch, the flame sputtering out in the dust as he stared at Thomas Hayes in disbelief. Sam Porter felt his hatred drain away, replaced by a sick understanding of how easily he'd been used in another man's scheme for revenge and profit. Jake finally moved, not toward his gun but toward Judge Crawford, his approach slow and deliberate as a stalking mountain lion. The derringer in Crawford's hand might as well have been a child's toy for all the threat it posed to a man who'd survived cavalry charges and Apache raids. The silent cowboy's presence seemed to fill the entire street, his authority stemming not from any badge or title, but from the moral certainty that radiated from his very being. Sheriff Coleman stepped aside, recognizing that this moment belonged to forces larger than local law, that justice was about to be served by hands more capable than his own. Margaret burst from her house and ran toward her husband, tears streaming down her face, as she realized the nightmare was finally ending. Thomas caught her in his arms, both of them weeping with relief and joy as the sun broke fully over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and pink. The light seemed to wash away the darkness that had gripped Redemption Creek, revealing the ugliness of what had almost transpired in its harsh, honest glow. The couple clung to each other as if they were drowning, understanding how close they'd come to losing everything to one man's greed and desperation. Judge Crawford made one last desperate move, swinging his derringer toward Margaret and Thomas with the wild intention of finishing what he'd started. But Jake was already there, his hand closing around Crawford's wrist with the precision of a steel trap, the derringer falling harmlessly to the ground as the judge gasped in pain. The silent cowboy's grip conveyed everything that needed to be said about justice and consequences, about the price of using fear and hatred as tools of personal gain. The crowd watched in fascination as Crawford crumpled to his knees, finally understanding that his reign of manipulation and corruption had come to an end. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward to arrest Judge Crawford, the evidence of his crimes now clear to everyone present, as Thomas Hayes recounted his kidnapping and the planted evidence in vivid detail. The morning that had begun with the promise of lynching ended with the real criminal in custody, while an innocent woman embraced her husband in the growing daylight. Jake stepped back into the shadows, his work finished, preparing to mount his horse and ride away as quietly as he'd arrived. But something in Margaret's grateful eyes and Thomas's extended hand suggested that perhaps Redemption Creek had earned itself a permanent guardian, a silent protector who would ensure that justice and mercy walked hand in hand through its dusty streets. The full truth emerged as Thomas Hayes recounted his ordeal to the assembled crowd, his voice growing stronger with each word as the horror of his near-death experience transformed into gratitude for his miraculous survival. Judge Crawford had approached him 3 nights ago with what seemed like a friendly invitation to a private poker game, only to drug his whiskey and arrange for hired men to drag him to the abandoned Silverdale mine. The plan had been diabolically simple: stage Thomas's murder, frame Margaret for the crime, and claim the Hayes property as payment for fabricated gambling debts that existed only in Crawford's ledger books. The judge had counted on the town's willingness to believe the worst about a widow, especially one married to a man with Thomas's reputation for cards and drink. Jake listened to the confession with the same quiet intensity he'd shown throughout the confrontation, understanding how close evil had come to triumphing through manipulation and mob mentality. He'd seen it before in other towns, other times, where fear and prejudice made ordinary people into instruments of injustice. The silent cowboy had learned that sometimes the greatest evil wasn't found in obvious villains, but in those who used positions of trust and authority to corrupt the very foundations of civilized society. Judge Crawford represented everything Jake had spent years fighting against: the abuse of power for personal gain, regardless of the innocent lives destroyed in the process. Margaret held Thomas tightly, feeling the solid warmth of his body against hers and marveling at how close she'd come to losing everything to another man's greed. The past few days had been a nightmare of accusation and isolation, watching neighbors she'd known for years turn against her with frightening speed. She thought about the women who had crossed the street to avoid her, the children who had thrown stones at her windows, and the complete abandonment she'd felt as the town prepared to execute her for a crime she hadn't committed. Now, in the growing morning light, she understood how fragile the bonds of community really were, and how quickly fear could transform familiar faces into those of strangers. Sheriff Coleman supervised Crawford's arrest with grim satisfaction, finally understanding how the judge had manipulated him throughout the investigation. The planted evidence, the rushed timeline, the pressure to avoid a thorough investigation. It all made sense now that the truth had emerged. Coleman had known Margaret since childhood, had attended her wedding to Thomas, and had felt sick every time he'd looked at the so-called evidence against her. His badge felt heavier now, weighted with the knowledge of how close he'd come to participating in judicial murder through his own inaction and doubt. The crowd began to disperse as the drama reached its conclusion, individual members slinking away with shame written across their faces like brands of guilt. These were men who had been prepared to watch a woman hang, who had brought ropes and torches to ensure a fellow citizen's death before breakfast. The harsh morning light revealed them not as instruments of justice, but as tools in a corrupt man's scheme, and that realization would haunt many of them for years to come. Bill Hancock retrieved his fallen torch, the cold ashes clinging to his fingers like a reminder of how close he'd come to participating in murder. Jake prepared to mount his horse and continue his journey, his mission in Redemption Creek completed with the restoration of truth and justice. But Thomas Hayes approached him before he could leave, extending his hand in gratitude and asking for the silent cowboy's name, wanting to know who had saved his wife's life and his own future. The request hung in the air between them, a simple human desire for connection after sharing a moment of profound crisis. Jake hesitated, unused to personal thanks or recognition, more comfortable disappearing back into the vast anonymity of the frontier than accepting praise for actions he considered simply necessary. Margaret joined her husband in thanking their mysterious protector, her eyes bright with tears, as she recognized the depth of what this stranger had done for them. She had watched him face down an entire mob with nothing but moral authority and quiet courage, understanding that such men were rare in any time or place. The widow who had faced death before dawn now stood free in the sunlight, her reputation restored, and her future secured by the intervention of a man whose motives seemed as pure as they were mysterious. She offered Jake their home, their friendship, their permanent gratitude, knowing that such an offer could never truly repay the debt they owed him. The sun climbed higher in the sky as Jake finally spoke his name, the simple introduction carrying more weight than formal titles or elaborate speeches ever could. He accepted their thanks with quiet dignity, explaining that he'd learned long ago that some fights were worth having, regardless of the personal cost or the odds against success. The silent cowboy revealed that he'd once been where Thomas was now, falsely accused, abandoned by those he'd trusted, saved only by the intervention of a stranger who chose to stand against injustice when it would have been easier to ride away. As Jake mounted his horse and prepared to leave Redemption Creek, Sheriff Coleman approached with a request that surprised everyone present. The lawman offered Jake a deputy's badge, recognizing that the town needed men of his caliber to prevent future tragedies like the one they'd narrowly avoided. The proposal represented more than employment. It was an acknowledgement that true law enforcement required not just the authority of badges and weapons, but the moral courage to stand against popular opinion when justice demanded it. The crowd that remained watched expectantly, hoping their mysterious protector might choose to make their town his permanent home. Jake studied the offered badge for a long moment, understanding the weight of responsibility it represented and the trust it implied from a community that had almost committed an unforgivable act. His answer came not in words, but in actions, as he pinned the star to his vest and settled back into his saddle with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found his purpose. The silent cowboy had come to Redemption Creek as a stranger riding through, but he would remain as its guardian, ensuring that never again would fear and hatred masquerade as justice in the growing light of any dawn. And in that decision, both he and the town found something they hadn't known they were searching for, a chance at redemption that lived up to the community's hopeful name.